Today's dedication is for Terax, who gave me a very generous 1 year's worth of subscriptions on Patreon. Dragon Week, starring the Dragon, Akiri, Tetsuo, and Etali. Now, in my rush to play this game, I played it out and forgot to hit the record button, so we're going through a replay on Magic Online here. I think it is worth watching, so obviously that's why I've decided to attempt to show this to you. Hopefully the replay function doesn't bug out on us like it does sometimes on Magic Online. Decide to keep this hand, of course. We do have access to green and a rampant growth on turn 2, so I'm hoping that we can get into the colours that we need to actually do something here. Although unfortunately not seeing a land, it is a Crux of Fate on turn 1. Etali ramping immediately, as you would expect. We see a wild growth onto a land, and then the Boros player gets down SRAM Senior Edificer, ready to throw equipment into that. We draw not into a land, but into a Smothering Tithe, so at this point we were always going to go for the rampant growth. We do not have access to white mana, so thinking hopefully we can get into a land next turn so that we can play Smothering Tithe with the use of our rampant growth planes. More ramp from Etali with the Farseek, and again more ramp with Sol Ring for Tetsuo. Then manages to get himself a Foundry Inspector, making the artifacts cost 1 less. Akiri showing us the first equipment, which cantrips off the SRAM, so already drawn a card to this. 1 to equip, then when you hit someone with it, draw 2 and discard 1. So of course throws it on SRAM, and it's just a case of seeing who he attacks here. He comes in towards us. Now, I remember saying at the time I'd be worried about Etali personally, especially when we are missing lands, so draw Niv-Mizzet Perun, but do not manage to see another land here, so all we can do is play the Garruk's Uprising and hope that we can play some creatures into that. Won't even cantrip when it enters, so not getting down the Smothering Tithe hurts there. We're already being left behind. More ramp from Etali, that will be most of the deck you would think. Sakura Tribe Elder, and a 3 visits for an untapped land. And then down to 2 cards, even manages to get out a Delighted Halfling to make his commander uncounterable. So yeah, Etali's looking pretty good. We'll have access to 2, 4, 6 and 8 mana next turn. Expressive Iteration for Tetsuo will allow him to look at some cards. And then he did manage to make himself a land by turn 3, so throws out a 1 mana Felwar Stone. And then we see the Affinity for Artifacts spell Thoughtcast, drawing 2 cards. And the Foundry Inspector correctly looking over at Etali, dealing 3 damage over there. Although he has opened himself up to the equipment player here, and that's scary, specifically with a Sigarda's Aid. Manages to play the Dowsing Dagger at sorcery speed into that, so it will be automatically equipped to the SRAM. And just a case of seeing if he gives us any plant tokens or not. He does not, decides to give them to Tetsuo, so that shows who he's looking at attacking here. And with his 4-3 does swing in towards us again, so is going to draw 2, discard 1 and flip round the Dowsing Dagger, turning it into the Lost Veil, which taps for 3 mana of 1 colour. Ramping nicely, unlike us. So we'll go up to 8 cards in hand here, and has already discarded Aurelia, didn't look at that previously, and this turn decides to discard Valakut Awakening, and after that we see Akiri Fearless Voyager hit play. So once again, we are eager for a land, can't even hold up the Anguished Unmaking without black mana here, and 2 turns in a row we are missing a land, so we've only got 3 lands thanks to the Rampant Growth. Draw into the Rith Liberated Primeval, giving our Dragons Ward 2, but we're nowhere near any dragons at the moment, so really expecting to not do anything here and just pass the turn again. A Bonder's Enclave hits play, and right after that we see an Etali Primal Conqueror. So it gets himself, I think this is his own Conjurer's Closet. He takes our Steely Resolve, and then saw here a Joyrus Familiar, which he doesn't take for whatever reason. You would think he would just take it for the sake of having a blocker if nothing else. Although I'm sure he has artifacts in the list. Blasphemous Act decides not to cast as well for obvious reasons. Now our opponent is going to, I assume he gives his commander, yeah, he names Dinosaur with this, so he does give all his Dinosaur Shroud. This is obviously decent in a dragon or any tribal deck if you build around it. And Etali now has Shroud, so at least it can't be flickered by the Conjurer's Closet, which does target, so we do get a little bit of a rest from Etali. So indeed has to flicker his Dork instead. And now seeing another Affinity for Artifacts creature, Imskir Iron Eater. When it enters, draw X and lose X, where X is half the number of artifacts you control rounded down, and for 4 and sack an artifact. Deal damage equal to that mana value to any target. So he's at 37 and 6 cards in hand after that. And then manages to get himself into a Trailblazer's Boots as well, making... yeah, I think everyone's got a non-basic land, so making something unblockable. Steel Shaper's Gift is a tutor for an equipment, and decides to find himself Caldra Complete, which is an indestructible living weapon, and will be equipped for free thanks to the Sagada's aid. So SRAM draws another card, he stays at 7 in hand, and decides to throw this onto his commander, which is now an 8/8 with Flying Haste, Indestructible, Trample, and I'm holding priority during this for a few seconds at a time, so that we can threaten Swords to Plowshares and the like. Trying to keep commander damage off myself here, so they don't swing in with their commander, and instead decide to just hit us with the SRAM, which means they draw a card to their commander, and they will draw 2 and discard 1 again to the Mask of Memory. I even decide to tap my white mana down to show my opponents that I'm considering the Swords to Plowshares or something, but then untap and pass priority back over to my opponent, just trying every little trick I can to give myself as much time as possible here, because it's pretty much all I can do. So with the Mask of Memory, our opponent decides to discard a Lost Jitte, and then to hand size he had, must have been 9 cards in hand, so discarded a land tax and a basic land. Once again, we do not draw into a land, so that's 3 mana, 2 lands drawn into by turn 5. Drakuseth, I think, is what we discard here. And now I missed this play at the time, but soon worked it out based on the fact that we have just ended up with a Tricycle land out of nowhere. Turns out our opponent went for the Chaos Warp onto our Steely Resolve, or whatever it's called, the enchantment that they just stole from us. So they wanted to remove Shroud from Etali for obvious reasons, because they want to copy this as much as they can and flicker it. And because we own the enchantment, it's us that looks at the top card of the library and gets a permanent in, and that just so happened to be a land for us, so lucky that our opponent made that mistake there, really. Especially lucky because it's a tap land, we didn't want to draw into that next turn, play it and wait another turn cycle. Anyway, manages to get down a Flame Rush Rider and does dash that in, so he'll have to bounce it at the end of the turn, but it comes in with haste here. So we're wide open, we get the 3/3, we do not get the Etali though, that goes down the middle, but no prizes for guessing what the Rider makes a copy of here. So does get the copy of the Etali, can only keep 1 thanks to the legend rule of course, but gets the ETB when it does enter. And so now it is Ballad of the Black Flag, a Bruenor, grabs himself a Ruinous Ultimatum from us, and from his own list, gets more ramp with the Evasion of Zendikar, 2 basics into play tapped with that. So decides to play all of these spells here, no reason not to, and that means that our Garruk's Uprising ended up doing absolutely nothing. So Etali looking quite commanding here, as it will tend to. And the Ballad of the Black Flag, mill 3, you can put an historic card from amongst them into your hand. I think it was the Forest that got milled here, I don't think they got a historic permanent, so Birds of Paradise and E-Witness get milled as well. Damage is taken and the Flame Rush Rider goes back to hand with the dash. Conjurer's Closet getting flickered here. Noteworthy, they could have flickered the Flame Rush Rider if they put the triggers on the stack first in the right order, which they would have done here, and that would have kept this in play, but decides to just get more triggers on the Etali while it's in play, because you have to assume that our opponents are going to be looking to use spot removal here. So once again, get some ETBs, a Sunforger coming from the Boros player, Smuggler's Surprise from us would do nothing, Sundering Eruption, I think he decides not to use, and he's got a Halana and a Lena as well. Noteworthy that Sunforger would likely just be a buff here because he doesn't have the white mana in order to go out and tutor something, although I'm sure he's got plenty of targets to go for with that. Talisman of Indulgence, followed by a Memory Plunder for our opponents, so decides to target our Ruinous Ultimatum and blow up everybody's non-land permanents in total here, apart from the indestructible stuff here of course, so basically doing that to wipe out Etali's board, although he's got plenty of land ramp available to him. Another tutor for the Boros player, that was Birthright Boons, so searching for an equipment, it goes straight into hand and now has access to the double striking commander as well. and with that decided to tutor and play immediately the Hammer of Nazan, so has more access to Indestructible and gets the free equips, which is more the point of this thing, I imagine. Doesn't have a means of making his equipment an instant speed anymore, so a sorcery speed, Sword of the Animist, which will make this an 11-9. Does not have double strike, but with that last piece of mana does manage to get himself out of the blue into, if we can keep up with the client, a Colossus Hammer, so +10/+10 and loses flying, equipped to the commander automatically, making it a perfect 21 powered commander. Now does he keep coming in towards us is the question. He does not, thankfully, does the right thing in the end and attacks in towards Etali, draws a card when he does that and a Rampant Growth, and just like that, completely out of the blue, manages to take that player out. Luckily as well, we also managed to draw into a land, and I was glad to see that there because my thought here is, obviously we get down Smothering Tithe finally by turn 6, but if this player doesn't pay and Akiri doesn't pay, then we've got the mana held up for Anguished Unmaking. The risk always being that someone makes you discard that, but targeted discard isn't all that common in Commander, so we're just trying to avoid a Windfall or a Wheel of Fortune really, if we want to hold on to that. And I'm expecting the Grixis player might have some answers here anyway, because he won't want to get taken out by Akiri either. Do manage to make a treasure at the first chance, and of course the first thing we see is a Wheel of Fortune, so definitely not holding up the Anguished Unmaking now. Just need to hope that we draw into a Swords to Plowshares or something like that to protect ourselves against Akiri, because now that we've got a bunch of treasure from the Smothering Tithe and the Wheel combo, I'm assuming that Akiri is going to be swinging in straight towards us. Do not get into any removal, but we can hope that Teferi's Protection is going to allow us to get round to our next turn. So thanks to that Wheel of Fortune, we do draw into 7 new cards and make 14 treasure. And then the Grixis player just decides to pass through the turn with 4 mana held up, so unfortunately might be able to interact with us and ruin our day, even if we do manage to get out from underneath this. Up to 16 treasure at the beginning of Akiri's turn, and then we've got Bladehold War Whip, so a living weapon comes in with a 2/2 double striker unless he decides to give Akiri double strike, which he doesn't really need to, but he could always play around the Colossus Hammer being blown up. So decides to stack it so that the Bladehold War Whip ends up on a 2/2. Got more bodies that way. And then it's tutor number 3, I think, Enlightened Tutor, going for another equipment. This one will be stuck on top of the library though, unless he can draw into it with Akiri. Mantle of the Ancients now on top of the library. He will draw into it when he swings in with Akiri. So once again does decide to attack us now that we've got all those treasure before he goes for the draw. Not that it makes a difference, I don't think, here, because we know what he's getting into. It's just a good habit to get into. We decide on protecting ourselves for another turn cycle with the Teferi's Protection. And I'm just hoping that the Grixis player allows it through. Thought he might have some counter magic for us to make sure we go down, but Teferi's Protection does land. And maybe it's just going to be a 2 versus 1 to get rid of this Akiri player. We still have to get through our own turn and make sure that Tetsuo doesn't interfere with us. Following that phase up, after dealing no damage with Sword of Sinew and Steel, so can blow up an artifact and a Planeswalker with that. Obviously gives it protection from Rakdos as well. So along with Trample, that's one of his only pieces of evasion at this point. So if we can get enough dragons into play by some miracle, then hopefully we'll be able to actually block some damage from Akiri, is what I'm thinking at the time. Pip-Boy 3000 comes in. When the creature attacks, you can loot, put a plus counter on it, or untap 2 lands, and don't forget they do have a land that taps for multiple mana. And after that we see another living weapon in the Glimmer Lens. This is another 2/2, and when it and another creature attacks, you draw a card. Once again decides to make another body this time. Alright, so I was concerned before that the Tetsuo player is going to interfere with us, and by some miracle we finally get a bit of good luck and get ourselves a Dragon Lord Dromoka. Can't be countered, and once it hits play our opponents can't do anything during our turn. So I decide to play it risky here. We've got 3 dragons in hand, but I want to maximise the number of cards drawn from Kindred Discovery, and I think that they'll let this down, thinking that something else a lot more threatening could come down afterwards, and they wish they countered that. Obviously when we play Dragon Lord Dromoka into the Kindred Discovery, it will trigger it, so that does come down successfully. And now it's a case of our opponents hopefully not being able to do anything about the Dragon Lord Dramoka hitting play. Still a long ways off here though. I'm just kind of playing things out and seeing what happens. So when that enters, we draw a card, gets us into a roaming throne. And with double triggers, that could be very useful to us. So I think what I decide to do here, we've got an equipment player over there who obviously has a lot of artifacts. So the Cavern Horde Dragon only costs red and red, meaning that we've got enough mana to go for Roaming Throne and the Cavern Horde Dragon. And we'll get double the triggers from this, I think is my plan. Yeah, so decide to get down Roaming Throne. Of course, as a dragon, it enters as a dragon, so triggers the Kindred Discovery again. And I haven't played a land yet, because I'm not sure how much mana I'm going to need, but it would be nice to get down the World Tree tapped. Draw into another cantrip effect in the Great Henge, which currently costs 4, I think. So in that case, this is why I held off on the land. Yeah, we can go for 4 mana into the Great Henge, and then we'll still have double red held up for Tiger and a treasure, Cavern Horde Dragon. And that means that the dragons will draw us 2 cards from that point onwards. So play the Tiger, and don't go for the World Tree after all. And then the Great Henge comes into play for that 4 mana. And after that, it is the hasty Cavern Horde Dragon. Noteworthy our opponents can't do anything during our turn, don't forget. So with that, the Great Henge and the Kindred Discovery trigger. Drawing goes 2 cards. We've only got 1 dragon left, but managed to see some more card draw in the Return of the Wild Speaker and another land. So time to make some more treasure here. We'll head straight in towards the Akiri player, who does not have any flyers in play at the moment. So Kindred Discovery triggers again thanks to our hasty attacker. And that allows us into a Demonic Tutor, so now the mind starts worrying. What do we go for here? Minamo is about the only thing our opponent could do here, so it decides to untap the Akiri, which even if it did have flying equipped to it, it can no longer have flying thanks to the Colossus Hammer. So that means that it could never have blocked the Cavern Horde Dragon, thankfully for us. So we do manage to hit our opponent and get the 2 Cavern Horde Dragon triggers thanks to the Roaming Throne, which means we get 8 treasure plus another 8 treasure. So then the question is, do we tutor or do we go for card draw with Return of the Wild Speaker? And I'm thinking at the moment we've been so much on the back foot all game that I think we deserve to go for something obnoxious, so I think I go for the Demonic Tutor here. And yep, there we go. Looking round here, I'm not really all that concerned with anything at all, apart from maybe Cyclonic Rift, but I think what we're looking at here is the elephant in the room, the Omniscience. So I do decide to tutor that into hand, and we can of course afford to cast it without any concern of counter magic from our opponent. Now an Omniscience doesn't automatically win it for us here, we do still need to make some good draws, and there's no guarantee that we're going to win this turn, but Omniscience does hit play of course, and then if the client will give up for a minute, drew a load of cards with Return of the Wild Speaker for free, and ended up drawing into a whole heap of lands here. So luckily we still got into another dragon and another creature here to trigger some card draw. So just decided to throw down the Scale Lord Reckoner, again drawing 2 cards, but now starting to get flooded with 2 lands drawn off the Scale Lord Dragon. So try our luck again with Ataka, and with the Ataka we draw even more lands, so just end up with a whole heap of lands on top here. The last chance was getting down the Sarkhan Solar Flame, and once again with a really lucky top deck that we were due frankly, Rivaz of the Claw is going to allow us to cast a creature from our graveyard with 6 mana held up. Assuming that we don't draw into more dragons here. Rivaz is not a dragon, so only cantrips with the Great Henge here. The Nature's Law, I think I preemptively decide to play straight away. Yes, and judging by the next play that I make, I should have held off on the Nature's Law, because with the Rivaz, like I said, we're able to play a dragon from the bin, and with the 6 mana up, notice that we've got exactly enough for Niv-Mizzet Parun, so decide to get straight into that. Niv-Mizzet Parun does manage to enter play, triggers both of our cantrip effects, as well as Sarkhan. Now Sarkhan can become a copy of Niv-Mizzet, and I couldn't remember how exactly it worked. I think that because it keeps its name, Sarkhan Solar Flame, we get to keep 2 legendary copies of a permanent, but I wasn't sure here, so I just decided to risk it anyway. We draw our cards from the cantrip effects, which triggers the Niv-Mizzet Parun for 1 damage to any target. So from now on, I just pile all this in at the Boros player. And I do say yes to Sarkhan a Flame here. So now when the other cantrips resolve, we've got a couple of triggers per Sarkhan, or per Niv-Mizzet Parun I should say, because we draw a card that causes a triggered ability of a ping, which is doubled up by the Roaming Throne, so 1 card draw equals 4 damage as it stands now. So it could have been a really bad time if I had been punished for playing the Nature's Law preemptively, but luckily we did manage to get ourselves into an Utvara Hellkite, which of course draws us 2 cards off the cantrips, meaning a total of 8 damage from our Niv-Mizzet Paruns here. So with the first round, have our opponent down to 22, the Great Henge will now resolve and draw us another card, pinging our opponent down to 18, and now decide to, what I should have done there is got down the Dragon Tempest because it will speed this whole process along, but decide instead on the Sky Shroud Claim. Casting a sorcery triggers a card draw on both the Niv-Mizzet Paruns, so that means that we draw 2 cards, and then because it's a triggered ability, double that up, so 4 cards drawn, which means it's 4 times 4 with regards to damage, which is 16 for any non-mathematicians. So 2 more draw triggers on the stack, the penultimate one resolves, 4 more damage with our opponent now at 10. And then with that last trigger for the Sky Shroud Claim, our opponent sitting at 6, so we're going to have to find 2 more damage from somewhere, but I think we're going to be okay now. We've got a couple of dragons in hand ready to draw 2 cards into, and another instant in the form of Cyclonic Rift. The Dragon Tempest is going to deal a lot of damage as well, of course. Haste not as relevant now that we've already attacked with the Cavern Horde Dragon, but I'm just glad that we get to win on this turn and don't have to pass it through another turn cycle with our fingers crossed. So Dragon Tempest entered, and followed that up with the Silumgar, the Drifting Death. So Dragon Tempest gives it haste, it deals damage equal to the number of dragons you control, so knock this player down to -7, and it should be pretty quick to get rid of the Grixis player from there. And with all those triggers on the stack, we still had more Niv-Mizzet Parun stuff to go through thanks to the Great Henge. Our opponent decides to end the game and scoop it up. Drew into, at the very end there, another Goldspan Dragon. So thankfully the replay function decided to work this time, and I'm glad that I got to show this game to all of you because it's yet another example that you shouldn't quit too easily in a game because you never know how it's going to end up. If our opponent hadn't gone for that Wheel of Fortune into our Smothering Tithe, then I highly doubt we would have been able to catch up with the Akiri player, but as I've also said 100 times, just because you don't have anything in your hand doesn't mean that your opponents aren't going to affect your board. So you should always play it out, and this proves it once again. Anyway, I've preached to you enough. Massive thank you to the patrons for supporting the channel. If you do enjoy these videos and want to support me financially, then you can do so yourself via the link in the description below, which will take you through to Patreon. Massive thank you to those of you who do that already again. I'm Tribalkai. Thank you for watching.